Welcome back, Visions fans. Ready Player Will here. This is the follow-up video for Terra about the potential of Espers. Now like never before. I'm not going to say this is going to change the game, but there's something very unique about her, what you can do with them, that I want to go over high level for everybody. So, getting into things, if we're looking at the Esper gauge in particular, we need to understand what the gauge rate, fill rate is, how you can best fill it up. And so for that, we're going to very high level look at the WOTV website itself. And so if you read filling the Esper gauge, it fills every time you attack an enemy. And it fills faster if the attack is made from the side or behind. When the enemy is attacked at a weak point, meaning if they have like a negative resistance, I'm pretty sure that's what that means. When a critical hit is achieved, or when an enemy is KO'd, right? So every time you attack an enemy, you fill up the gauge no matter what. But there are some things that you can do to make it fill faster. This applies to every character in the game. What we're going to do here now is a couple tests to see just how fast we can actually fill the Esper gauge. And in particular, we're going to abuse two things here in Terra's kit. The first one is going to be Madwin's Guidance, where this passive greatly increases the evocation gauge acquisition. And this is important because she has an active ability that will immediately boost that up. And so this ability fills a portion of the evocation gauge. Now, if you want to know how dramatically the difference is between the two, so on the left is if you use that ability, Commune with the Espers, but you don't have the passive on, you get like, what, 20% of the gauge filled? Well, if you use that ability, Commune with the Espers, with the Madwin passive on, you're suddenly in like the 40 to 45% range on turn 1. I mean, again, depending on what passes you have equipped for Terra, it could be turn 2. The AI obviously has different priorities. But if you make it a concerted effort to use this buff early on in the battle, you will essentially get 40% of your Esper gauge for free without even attacking an enemy. Okay, so go with me here as we do some really high-level examples live to get an idea of how many attacks does it actually take, because unfortunately there isn't any data mined information exactly upon how many points are in the gauge, or how many points you get per certain kinds of attacks, or how quickly it fills. So when it comes to the evoke rate up, unfortunately you can't really quantify it. I hate to be the bad news, but until someone comes back in here to really do the data mining, I don't have an answer for you. But we can still test it and get a rough approximation of an answer. So what we're going to do is here we're going to attack a Joom, my own teammate, head on, because that's we don't want to do any side or back. We essentially want to assume, you know, Guild War, you get 3 people on one side, 3 people on the other, they kind of face on, right? That's kind of how we're going to try to assume this. Now, I also have here one magic user, Terra, who will theoretically do more damage if she used a magic attack to Joom, but we're actually not going to do that. We're going to use slash and missile type attacks for all of this. So although this is the story map, we're going to just pretend for the sake of turn order, let's say this is the current Guild War map. And so what would you expect? You expect turn 1, Rain's going to do a buff, and that's fine, we'll let him buff 1, so he'll get some AP. Cetia is going to do a buff, Domain of Fire, we'll do this one here. Joom is going to do a buff, we'll do Wind Blessing, obviously it's not what she'd really use, but the fact of the matter is we're talking turn order, right? And now comes Terra's turn. Now, Terra's priority in terms of AI is that she will always use Focused Magic Release first, okay? So if you want her to use Commune with the Espers on turn 1, you have to turn Focused Magic Release off. Let's assume we do that, just again for the sake of stress testing. If we do Commune with the Espers, evocation gauge up, and if you look at the current gauge here on the right, you're talking like 40% filled already. So then the question really begs itself, okay, after she uses that, how many attacks does it take to get the Esper gauge filled? So if we suddenly take King Mont, pull him in here, we'll have him do some of these low. And again, she's not weak to slash, so this shouldn't do extra. If it's crit hit, it will probably fill a little faster. As they mentioned, we're going to have Cetia come back here. We'll have her use Ashmaker. Bam, that's hit number 2. And it was a critical hit, so the gauge filled probably just a little bit more. We're going to do hit number 3. We'll use Sonic Pulsar, which is a slash type ability. So we're on hit number 3. Gauge is getting there. Cetia will have her attack again. Ashmaker, hit number 4. Almost have that gauge. 5 attacks. There's like 1 or 2 critical hits that were in there, but 5 attacks. None of them were weakness oriented, and they were all relatively from the front. I don't think Cetia counts as the side. I could be wrong on that though. But at minimum, that means like at 5 just general hits, which is essentially like a turn and a half, you will have an Esper far faster than what you would have otherwise. Now again, that's like the base. We're going to redo this, and we're going to actually try to like attack from the sides and behind and use the magic to try to see if we can get it even quicker. And then we're going to do it with Terra's TMR. So we're going to do functionally the same thing here, except we're going to turn Joom around. and we're going to emphasize the magic attacks on Terra. That way you can get faster Esper gauge fill. So turn 1, we'll have Mod do the same thing here, just a little AP generation. Use a buff. Cetia will do the same thing, Domain of Fire. June, we'll have move over here, put on the physical barrier, and now we're going to have her turned around as compared to before. And Terra, we're going to use Commune with the Espers, and you can see the Esper gauge again will be 40% full, approximately. So now, if we have King Mont come in here, I'm going to have him do Iron Blow here. That's a back attack, non-critical. Then going to have Cetia. And at this point, I think Cetia is considered from the side or the back. Quite honestly, I'm not 100% sure. I don't know how the game orients itself to consider a back attack or side attack. But just for the sake of Terra and Mont are exactly behind, I'm going to put Cetia directly next to Joom in the attempts that the game considers this a side attack. So we'll do Ashmaker. This is attack number 2. Okay, so we're 2 attacks in. Terra, Esper gauge bar, looking 70% full. We're now going to have her use Meltdown, which Joom is technically weak to. This attack number 3. We are like 80%. And now here, attack number 4. You now have an Esper gauge filled up. The bottom line is you get roughly between 4 and 5 attacks your Esper gauge, and this has positively massive ramifications on the rest of the battle, and I'll explain why in just a couple minutes. I want to look at one additional thing though. This is using Terra's TMR to see how much faster it even gets. Now someone beat me to it on Reddit earlier talking about Terra's TMR for manual and class match as a potential thing to abuse, and they're 10 billion% right. There is something to be abused here potentially. And so in this case, I'm going to have Terra use Commune with the Espers, but I'm going to have her use the TMR ability also to see if that changes how many attacks it takes. And I'm going to be conservative here and only have her use it on herself and one teammate, not both. Because quite frankly, if you do want to apply this to auto, which is like 98% of the game, we got to be a little realistic with what our expectations are. So we'll start off the battle here again. So King Mont, have him do Proclamation. I'm going to have him stay here. I'm going to have Cetia do the same thing here, but I'm going to have her move away. I'm going to have Joom come back over here, use her defense shield so I don't kill her by accident. I'm going to keep her turned around for now. And then I'm going to have Terra come here, and I'm going to have her use her Limit Break. Modwin's Protection. So this is going to give both her and King Mont extra evocation gauge fill rate up. That's a mouthful. So I'm going to have King Mont move in here. So we're going attack number 1. Iron Blow from behind, and it's a critical hit, so a little bit extra. Cetia, we're going to go attack number 2. So we're up to 2 attacks here now. Then going to have Terra use Commune with the Espers. This is the one that fills up the gauge pretty heavily. So we'll still only 2 attacks, but we're already at the 80% rate, even higher. So Joom's going to hang out here for a second. Now, Cetia does not have the evocation up. We'll see if she actually gets the 20% necessary. I don't think she will. I think it's going to be close, very close. But then King Mont, this is attack number 4. So you can see roughly about the same, and you get your Esper gauge filled up still. And don't forget that obviously is accelerated if you apply the two teammates. Would even be more accelerated is if I had like Regal Glaciella here, and I had another magic user who was using magic attacks rather than the missile and the slash, right? The bottom line is, in a relatively quick amount of time, I think, 1 turn rotation of everybody of attacks is pretty darn fast. That on the next follow-up attack that you can use an Esper is incredibly, incredibly powerful, and I'm going to talk to you about why. So one of the reasons why we don't often talk about Esper abilities in the game is that they are a smidge more niche for PvE content when it comes to raids, when it comes to Trials of Reckoning to get certain kinds of imperils, team buffs, and it's because they take quite a long time to actually get that for normal PvP content. The battle's usually over by the time you actually fill up your Esper gauge. With that no longer necessarily being the case, all of a sudden we can look at Esper abilities as if they were Terra's own attack, if you know what I mean. And there's a couple which, quite frankly, do really great things for the Firecast. There's a couple other which you may not think would necessarily benefit, but have some incredibly strong upside. For now, we're going to talk about just a couple of the fire ones. So one of the benefits of the Espers is that all of the attacks are 100% hit chance. So for the Firecast, which is normally very inaccurate, the fact that you can use a 100% hit chance ability right there in the middle of the battle is quite strong, and most of these Espers are typically AoE. So if you are seeing Locke and Elena, well, you now have an AoE 100% hit chance ability. Fire doesn't normally get that. Terra is one of the few that has it, but the other characters don't. So if you use something like Brachiosaur here, well, the big ability, it's going to do, number one, a lot of damage because it's strike type damage. 240% modifier is way higher than your average ability. It's going to increase the AP consumption of the enemies by 50% for 3 turns. It's going to be a 50% fire imperil. 50% fire imperil. I am like giddy with excitement thinking about that on like the second or third turn of a battle. You are going to obliterate enemies if you can imperil them with a 50% fire imperil. And you're obviously going to increase the attack and magic of all your units by 100% for the clock times. I won't get into that because it's a whole weird math equation. But like Brachiosaur, stellar. Death Machine, a little bit less in the way of the fire resistance down, but it's a much, much, much more generous long-range AoE, whereas Brachiosaur, you kind of got to be up close. But Death Machine's a fantastic Esper for Mont. I can't see a reason why you may not potentially have it on him. Ifrit's kind of the cheat man's version of this, but he does technically have an immensely high modifier for the attack type, and it is magic type. So again, if you're thinking about someone like Locke, who's minus 5% magic weakness, like this is going to obliterate him. And then if you're talking about longevity in the battle, an Esper like Phoenix grants, it restores HP 60% for the allies all around you. So if you have the Phoenix Esper on someone, all of a sudden your teammates 3 turns into the battle, getting a little low on health, but that's okay because Terra and King Mon are really bulky, really sturdy health pools that you suddenly restore HP of 60% to them and grant regen for 3 turns as well, while also decreasing fire resistance by 50% for all the enemies. Like insane ability for like the second round of attacks in. Now we're talking just the fire Espers for now, but there's a handful of others that have a ton of utility. One of my favorites to potentially think about is Carbuncle. So you mean to tell me 2 to 3 turns in that I can give King Mont Reflect for 3 turns and all the allies? You mean Mont, who's like not a great magic tank, can have Reflect for 3 turns for himself and the allies? That, I don't want to say it's broken, but like I can't think of a time where Carbuncle was like ever viable in PvP because of this ability, despite the fact that like everyone knows about it and everyone like wants to be able to use it. And obviously the rest of the buffs, you don't get the same upside. Like it's a light imperil, you're only getting a minor attack and magic buff, that's whatever. But Reflect by itself is extremely powerful. And there's a couple other Espers that I want to point to that I think are extremely powerful as well. I think of Golden Ahriman, who is probably a decent enough Esper to put on your King Mont. The only problem with this Esper is that it is single target, but there's a lot on this ability where it's a chance to petrify the target, definite chance to blind them, definite chance to silence them. So if you're talking about a tank like Celeste or something who's a magic tank, if you can silence her, like that's fantastic. You essentially stop at like all her abilities for a while. And obviously you get like the minor 20% buffs, that's no big deal, but you're looking really more at the abilities. But the chance to petrify an enemy, are you kidding me, in PvP? I think Typhon is also an interesting one where it is a different kind of AoE, but you get almost a guaranteed stun depending upon how they're lined up. So that one, a little more situational, but not one to omit. I say that because Typhon is a great Esper for Terra, so there's a chance for her to use this. 2 of my other favorite ones, Fenrir and Aegion. So Fenrir, although you're not getting the benefit of the Imperil here, this is a fairly forgiving ranged AoE with a 67% chance to paralyze that whole group of enemies. That's extremely powerful. And Aegion is the same thing, where it's a much closer AoE, but it's a non-type damage attack for a 200% modifier with a chance to inflict paralyze on that same group of enemies. That status effect, I would love to give that status effect to some of the high faith units we're seeing. Another interesting Esper that's kind of brand new here, Dark Odin. If you look at what he has to offer, again, it's a magic type attack. It's a pretty generous ranged AoE. 100% hit chance, 67% chance to apply poison, which we know is kind of a courage counter, that if you can inflict poison on a group of enemies when they proc their courage, and in some instances the re-raise depending upon the HP recovered, you basically kill them after they use their attack. So if you can AoE this and get Engelbert and Elena in a mass poison attack on the 3rd turn, fantastic. Now we're only looking at UR Espers, and quite frankly, the MR Espers, the abilities are not nearly as impactful. I wouldn't do this whole build just for an MR Esper ability. But if you are looking for potential, I think the best one is probably the Merilith, where I quite frequently recommend this for Cetia because it has the missile attack, it has the accuracy, it has the fire attack, that overall I think it's a really strong board for Cetia given that she's not very accurate. Well, the ability of this is a 50% slash imperil for the target in particular, and it's technically a triple hit. So although you probably will be using this on someone like a tank, obviously, who generates the aggro, you mean to tell me you can imperil a 50% slash attack imperil on a tank for a triple hit for then King Mont and Terra to follow up on with slash type damage, like I think that's an incredible thing to potentially exploit. So overall, I don't think this is gonna, massively revolutionize anything, and I don't think it's gonna be some new meta to have the Espers, because as I mentioned, it does take some AI fine tuning. Where number one, you need to make sure that Terra uses the TMR appropriately if you're going for that route. So you gotta have to, make sure it's the right map for them to come together. You have to make sure that she has the right buffs on so that you use commune with the Espers. You are potentially sacrificing a little bit of her bulk or offensive potential by putting Maduin's guidance as the passive as opposed to one of the other three very good passives. So there's definitely some trade-offs to be had, and it's not going to work all the time. But I think this is something brand new that we haven't had an opportunity to use in the game that I really do think could be viable given the right circumstances. So I'm looking forward to playing with this a lot more, trying to see which Espers really turn the tide in the majority of the battles, how we can fine-tune the AI to really maximize this. It's something I can't wait to tinker more with. Hopefully this is a little eye-opening, insightful for all of you, and look forward to doing more content related to it.